Why is Paul writing about politics to the church in Rome? Our attitude as British people is often that faith and politics shouldn't miss, and our politicians particularly like to tell us that when the church challenges them over the way they act. And yet, in Paul's time in Rome, there was a real threat by the governing authorities towards Christian people. Remember, not many years before Paul wrote Romans, the Emperor Claudius had issued an edict throwing the Jews out of Rome. And then when Claudius died and Nero became emperor, he was the emperor when Paul was writing, the authorities might be more suspicious of Christians because they'd be seen as a subgroup of those troublesome Jews who Claudius threw out. Now, Nero is the emperor when Paul is writing Romans, although he's in his early years when Paul's writing in about AD 57 or 58, when things were actually rather calmer. It's not until after the fire of Rome when Nero blamed the Christians for it. But we do know in Romans 16:7 that some of the believers in Rome have been in prison. And presumably the reason Paul's writing this in Romans 13:1-7 is because there could be a danger of the Roman Christians rebelling against the authorities, and that would harm the reputation of the gospel among the Romans. There was also a real threat of anarchy in the first century. There was a danger of chaos because the authorities found it so hard to keep things under control. Remember, there wasn't a decent police force, and there was real corruption among rich and powerful people who acted very much as they wished. So Paul writes in verses 1-7 of our chapter today about how to relate to the governing authorities. And then he's going to speak more about love. Remember, the second half of Romans 12 was about love, and he's going to return to love. So it's as though we got a kind of love sandwich, because Romans 13:1-7 is about how you love the authorities. Paul's basic instruction is there in verse 1. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. You're to commit yourself to being subject to living in the shape of society that those governing authorities have created. Why do that? Well, look at how Paul goes on. There's no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. God's purpose, says Paul, is to have order in society. And that's provided by governing authorities. They are to act in certain ways to keep order. And Paul isn't necessarily saying the Roman Empire, everything about it is good. Indeed, later, Paul would be unjustly imprisoned for 4 years when he could have been freed. So the Roman Empire was perfectly capable of acting wrongly and unjustly. But he is reflecting the idea that God reigns over all. And so God is the one responsible for the authorities in place. Why be subject? What's the purpose of it? Well, verses 2-5 go on to talk about that. Verse 2, to be subject to the authorities is to be subject to God. If you resist the authority, you resist what God's appointed, and you'll incur judgment. If you rebel against the authorities, then you know what's coming to you. Because that's how God has structured the world. That's how God has structured society. But notice what kind of authorities he's talking about in verses 3 and 4. The authorities there are meant to be acting for people's good. Verse 3, they're not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what's good. You will receive its approval. Paul says the authorities are there to commend good conduct, to reward people for acting rightly. And verse 4, if you do wrong, you should be afraid, because the authority doesn't bear the sword in vain. It's the servant of God to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. They are agents, the authorities, of divine justice. They are God's servant is our translation in the NRSV that we're reading. The Common English Bible translates it, they are God's assistants. Or another version puts it, they are working for God. And they bear the sword. Now, sword bearers is used in a number of the ancient documents we have for the local police. That was how they enforced the law. Now remember, back in the second half of chapter 12, Paul urges the believers in Rome not to execute vengeance privately. And here's why. It's because the authorities are there to act justly. It's the authorities who act for God in exacting punishment on wrongdoers, not mob action by private citizens who feel wronged. Now, God can and does use people who are not believers to this end. Think of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 3, or think of Cyrus the Persian in Isaiah 45, whom Isaiah says is God's anointed servant. So, says Paul, be subject to the authorities, because then, verse 5, you'll have a clear conscience before God. What does that look like in practice? Well, Paul then literally cashes this out in verses 6 and 7. Pay taxes, he says. The authorities are God's servant. Pay taxes to them. Give revenue to the appropriate authorities. Give respect to the appropriate authorities. Give honour to them. You're to give appropriately as required. So pay your taxes, says Paul. There is no Christian basis for dodging taxes. Yes, of course, if there are rules in the tax system that allow you to pay less tax, that's fine. But taxes are a Christian thing to pay, because that's how we support our life together as a society and as communities. But what if? You can hear voices saying, but what if the governing authorities are corrupt? And they were in Paul's day too. Now, this section of Romans is not the only thing the Bible says about relating to governing authorities. So to be faithful to the Bible, I need to say a bit more. The book of Revelation, chapter 13, coincidentally, attacks the same Roman Empire only a few years later and portrays it as a beast rising from the sea attacking the people of God. Or think of the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, which pictures faithful Jews negotiating life with a pagan government. So in Daniel chapter 1, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, Daniel's three friends, and he resist eating meat that they're asked to eat while they're doing their academic training to be civil servants, because that meat's probably been offered to idols, and they, as good Jews, they don't want to be corrupted by that. Or think of Daniel chapter 3. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are civil servants by now, very senior civil servants, and they resist bowing down to Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue, which he wants everyone to bow down for, and they get thrown into the fiery furnace for their trouble. Have you ever noticed what they say to Nebuchadnezzar when Nebuchadnezzar says, if you don't bow down to my statue, I will throw you in the fiery furnace? Here's what they say in verses 16 to 18 of Daniel 3. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you set up. Isn't that astonishing? They don't say, well, if God delivers us, we'll be fine, but if he doesn't, then we'll bow down. No, under no circumstances will they worship the golden statue of Nebuchadnezzar, because that would be idolatry. That would be something that no right-thinking Jew would do. And they get thrown in the fiery furnace. And God does deliver them. But when they meet that absolute demand to worship something else, they say no. Because the first commandment is worship God alone. Well, think of Daniel chapter 6. Darius, the Persian, who's now the king, is persuaded by his officials to pass a law. No one may pray to anyone except him for 30 days. And yet Daniel continues to pray. And the whole thing, of course, is a setup by Daniel's fellow officials in order to hurt him. And as a result, Daniel's thrown into a den of lions. And God protects him there. But again, Daniel didn't know that God would save him from the den of lions. And yet, he continued to pray to God, knowing he was the one true God, because that was the right thing to do. So in the book of Daniel, there's negotiation going on. So Romans 13 isn't the only voice to listen to in the Bible when we're thinking about relating to the governing authorities. The principle of government comes from God. The particular governing authorities are under God's sovereign power and authority. Now, sometimes that's because God is acting to discipline his people when they sin, as happened at different times in the Old Testament with the Babylonians and the Persians. And you can't assume that because someone comes to power that God endorses everything they say. There are times and places when Jesus' kingdom will clash with Caesar's. And in those cases, Jesus comes first. I'm enjoying reading Dietrich Bonhoeffer's writings. He was a pastor in Nazi Germany, and he was part of the Confessing Church, which didn't adopt Nazi ideology when most of the established churches did. And he writes really thoughtfully about Christian discipleship in that time. And he very, very reluctantly joined a plot to kill Hitler, a plot which failed, and in the end was hanged just a few days before the Allies liberated the prison where he was held. For Bonhoeffer, being faithful meant resisting the Nazis, even to the point of trying to get Hitler killed. And he paid the ultimate price for that.